Our character challenge is built on the book of Proverbs. So maybe you don't have much experience with the book of Proverbs. I wanted to take a few minutes and explain some of the basics of how Proverbs works, and I hope this might be something that will enrich your study of the book so you can have a little better idea of what to do with it. So Proverbs is a collection of experiential wisdom over a long period of time. So just imagine if you went to the oldest, wisest person in your life and said, if you could write a letter back in time to your 13, 14-year-old self, what would it say? What advice would you give to a younger person? Well, the book of Proverbs is a reflection of people who actually did that. They went through life, they had good experiences, they had bad experiences, and as they processed these things, they said, here are some things we should have learned from this. Here are some good ways of being. If I could talk to a younger person, here are some things that I would say. Much of Proverbs is actually written as a dialogue. So for that reason, we felt it would be good to provide some discussion questions for you to try and use to incorporate these ideas into your life, especially with some kind of companion on your journey of faith, because Proverbs really does lend itself to that. So many passages are set up as a parent talking to a child saying, the other day, I was looking out my window and I saw this foolish young person and here's what they did. Don't you make that same mistake. You be wiser than that. It's got a very useful parental tone. Another thing about Proverbs that's important to understand is that there are sections of Scripture that are written as law. Proverbs is not a book of law. Proverbs is a book of principles. So it's not the case that every time you follow every principle in the book of Proverbs, you always get exactly the outcome that you're desiring. Life is difficult. There is genuine malevolence in the world. There are bad people with bad intentions. Sometimes we bump into those in life. So Proverbs is not a law that guarantees a specific outcome, but Proverbs contains many useful principles where if you're always in the business of course correcting, where you've started on your journey, but you continue to drink from the wisdom that's there and you say, well, I've moved this far, but I'm getting a little off in this way, but maybe if I steer myself back this other direction, I'll end up in a better place. Proverbs invites those kinds of actions. Much of Proverbs is set up in kind of a poetic fashion, very often in little two-line sections. So there are some different collections in the book of Proverbs. The first 9 chapters are longer essays about wisdom and the value of wisdom, and they're more self-contained units. Once you get past chapter 9 into chapter 10, these are more collections of little bitty tidbits. Sometimes they flow together well, sometimes they don't seem to be that related to each other. They're just bigger collections of good ideas from an older generation wishing well to the younger generation. Some of the collections that you would find would be starting in chapter 10. These are a collection of some of Solomon's smaller proverbs. Starting in chapter 22 to the first part of chapter 24, you have what they call 30 sayings of the wise. In chapter 25, you've got Hezekiah's Proverbs compiled from Solomon. So Solomon was such a wise person that he didn't even write down all of his best ideas. But Hezekiah, one of the good kings in the south, compiled a separate collection of Proverbs attributed to Solomon. There is also in chapter 24, several chapter section of what they call further sayings of the wise. These are followed by Proverbs by a guy named Agur. And then chapter 31, easily one of the most popular chapters of the book of Proverbs, we have teachings from a man named Lemuel's mother. So she's providing him with good insight. If you want to be a noble person, if you're going to be a king, this is the way you should govern over other people. And of course, the last part of Proverbs contains this beautiful picture of what they call the virtuous woman, the woman of noble character. So there's great larger collections of these things, but again, so many of them are in these little two-line parallel poetic sections with two ideas that kind of go together in different ways. So these are referred to as parallels, and so I want to mention to you a few different kinds of parallels you may encounter and what to do with those. Sometimes you'll find what they would call synonymous parallels. These are two ideas that go together really naturally. So, for example, Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Those two lines are saying exactly the same thing in two different ways. It's a nice way to reinforce a point. Another parallel that you're going to encounter is what they would call an antithetical parallel. So these are two ideas that say opposite things. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 1 would say, "A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son grief to his mother." Now, something you might also notice about this verse, it's setting up two opposites. There's the wise son and the foolish son, but it also involves the whole family, because truly, a wise son doesn't bring joy only to his father, but also to his mother. A foolish son doesn't bring grief only to his mother, but also to his father. So there are some creative ways in using these parallel structures that it's intended to be a little bit more encompassing of different people within the family or community scenario. So there are synonymous parallels, antithetical parallels. There are others that are called synthetic parallels. This means that you have an idea expressed in the first line, and then in the second line, there's another idea that nuances the first and even adds to it. So, for example, Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 26. "He who fears the Lord has a secure fortress, and for his children it will be a refuge." So what we see there is that the second line adds to the first line. The one who fears the Lord has a fortress, but there's an added benefit for his children. When you do something to make yourself solid with God, it doesn't only benefit you, it benefits those around you. Another thing I find really interesting in Proverbs is that sometimes you'll see them arranged in ways that are intended to create some sort of a tension. One of my favorite examples of this is in Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. This is part of why I would say you shouldn't view Proverbs as laws, because look at how you have to try and fit these two together. It says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him." Well, that's fair enough. But then there's the next proverb, the next parallel that says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." So, if you're looking at these as laws, it's, well, do I answer a fool or do I not answer a fool? But I think Proverbs invites you to be a wiser person in how you sort these things out. That it's necessary sometimes to instruct a foolish person with a better way of being. But it's also important that we're not overly harsh in our critiques, because we can actually become just like the person we would seek to criticize. So important to be self-aware as we go about trying to help others to live better. So you see how there's some tension set up in those verses and some different ways that those parallels can come into play. Proverbs is a rich resource. It's a great read. It's a book I've enjoyed immensely in my life, and I hope that as we go through this study together, you'll find many pearls of wisdom, some that you'll even want to hang on to and quote to yourself and to your family from time to time. Looking forward to our study and to our character challenge.